Hi, this is History MD coming to you with the latest historical emergency, environmental history. In our last video, we went over the introduction of Donald Hughes's What is Environmental History, a perfect read for anyone willing to familiarize themselves with the field. Today, I would like to give you my reading of its second chapter entitled Forerunners of Environmental History. Environmental history, as a conscious exploration of human relationships to the natural environment in the past, really began in the late 20th century, and as such, it is one of the newest scholarly endeavors. However, the questions asked by environmental historians are very old ones that attracted the interests of writers all the way from Greece to China throughout the centuries down to modern times. When we look at the ancient world, we realize that even the father of Western historiography, Herodotus, recorded a number of remarkable changes made in the natural environment by human activity. For instance, he believed that massive works like bridges and canals demonstrated an overreaching human pride that might call forth punishment by the gods. He wrote that when the Canadians started to dig a canal through the neck of the land that connected their city to the mainland in order to improve their defenses, the workmen suffered from an unusual number of injuries due to flying splinters of rock. Wondering why, the Canadians sent someone to ask the Oracle of Delphi, who replied in direct words, "Do not fence off the isthmus, do not dig. Zeus would have made an island had he willed it." Soon afterwards, tools were put down and work was ceased. Another striking story is that of Cleomenes of Sparta, who set fire to a sacred grove called Hiera Orgas, following which he lost his mind before cutting himself to pieces, resulting in his death. While Herodotus made only scattered references to environmental impacts, Thucydides, perhaps ancient Greece's greatest historian, actually began his work by developing a theory of environmental influences on history. For instance, he maintained that because Attica, the district around Athens, had a soil that was thin, dry, and relatively infertile, it was seen as unattractive to potential invaders, hence saving it from war and preserving it from depopulation. This relative safety made it a shelter for refugees, which further increased the population that over time exceeded the capacity of the land to feed them. The leaders of Athens had no other choice but to relieve this population pressure by sending out settlers to colonies across the seas. Thucydides also constantly referred to the need for natural resources, especially timber. When the Spartans conquered Amphipolis, the main reason was the procurement of timber for shipbuilding. We also know from his account that one of the aims of the Athenians in launching their invasion of Sicily was to conquer forests to get timber. Another ancient Greek author, convinced of the critical importance of the environment, was Hippocrates, who advanced a theory of environmental determinism. In his work, Airs, Waters and Places, he maintained that the health, temperament, and energy of people living in a place were governed by its position in relation to solar exposure, prevailing winds, climate, and the quality of its water supply. Plato was also conscious of environmental problems and noted the historical deforestation of the mountains of Attica. The former forest had served to store and release the rains, producing many springs, as evidenced by the shrines that stood at the springs that were dry in Plato's day. His view resonates with that of the Chinese philosopher Mencius, the second great sage of the Middle Kingdom after Confucius. Mencius described the deforestation in his homeland, notably with the description of the Ox Mountain. Another anthropogenic change that he noted was the cultivation of wasteland, which in turn had a positive impact on the environment. While the Greek historian Xenophon made similar observations concerning the king of the Persians, who apparently rewarded governors whose land was well cultivated, but punished those whose land was neglected and deforested. However, we see that in contrast to ancient Greek and Chinese authors, there is little common approaching environmental history in Roman historical writing. Cicero, for example, praised the ability of human beings to transform nature, writing that by means of our hands we endeavor to create, as it were, a second world within the world of nature. In contrast, the medieval author Ibn Khaldoun, the author of the Muqaddimah, ascribed the characteristics of various human groups to environmental influence in ways that mirror the thought of Hippocrates' airs, waters, and places. One of his remarkable opinions was that desert life kept people there from getting obese and toughened them up against famine. To him, members of the desert tribes were closer to being good and more courageous than urbanites, who relied on themselves rather than on the law and the defenses of the cities. This perspective stood in contrast to medieval Europe, where the traces of environmental thought that we find at this time is heavily marked by the influence of the Christian faith. Christianity regarded nature as God's creation that had been given to man to use and to care for, revealing God's goodness. For example, even though monasteries were often built in wilderness, changes brought about by human labor in the natural world were seen as useful and beautiful. The era witnessed a period of widespread agricultural expansion, settlement, and forest clearance in Europe. Medieval historians such as Cassiodorus, Paul the Deacon, Isidore of Seville, and Jordanes gave overpopulation and climate as reasons for the invasion of Central and Southern Europe. Changes in environmental legislation reflected this tendency, such as the introduction of the Norman Forest Law to England that created vast royal forests, reserving hunting rights for the king alone. But the culture in general was really oblivious to the fate of the environment, more concerned with kings and imperial conquest. This tendency was documented by the groundbreaking study by Richard Grove's Green Imperialism, a work concerned with human-induced deforestation and climate change. Indeed, European imperialism in general, it could be argued, was concerned first and foremost with the domination of nature, which was reflected in the fact that colonial regimes appointed directors of botanical gardens to important positions and made professional scientists advisors or even governors. Grove observed that states acted to prevent environmental degradation only when their economic interests were directly threatened. Meanwhile, philosophical ideas, science, indigenous knowledge, and threats to people and species were not enough reason for action. Dispossessed of the valuable resources presented by their environment, colonial peoples were faced with poverty and famine, which often led to rebellion. There were a few environmentalists, though, arguing for safeguarding and nurturing of nature. They were attracted to the Hindu and Jain views of harmony between people and nature that they encountered in India. Although the ability to equate the divine with all beings, and not just mankind, marked a very significant departure from Western biblical thought. These early colonial environmentalists showed an interest in indigenous knowledge and early conservation efforts such as the pre-colonial shikargahs, or wildlife and forest reserves established in Indian kingdoms. Environmental concern in the colonial perspective often went hand in hand with reformist sympathies for the welfare of local peoples. Scottish surgeon, naturalist, and botanist William Roxburgh connected ecological and climatic changes in India to epidemics and famines, eventually articulating a general critique of the impact of colonial policies on the Indian people and the environment. Authors that helped turn attention to environmental history included George Perkins Marsh, US ambassador to Italy, who published Man and Nature in 1864. He observed that many human activities such as deforestation depleted the natural resources on which civilization depended. He may be regarded as the first of the precursors to environmental history. He proclaimed that Earth was fast becoming an unfit home even for mankind. Rejecting man's domination over nature, as proclaimed by the Bible, his approach willed a balance between man and nature in which man's needs are met and nature's harmonies preserved. In his eyes, man could be a restorer of disturbed harmonies. But it was in the early and middle 20th century that a group of historians in France particularly traced the reciprocal influences of human societies and the environment on a global scale. This was done as part of an effort to broaden the horizon of history. These historians emphasized the importance of geographical settings, and in addition to having wide influence on historians and geographers, provided the impulse that helped to stimulate environmental history. They were called the Annales School, after the title of the journal they founded in 1929. One of the founders of the Annales School was Lucien Febvre. Other prominent members of the group included Fernand Braudel, Marc Bloch, Georges Duby, Jacques Le Goff, and Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. Among their productions, Febvre's book, A Geographic Introduction to History, became a classic. In this work, Febvre insisted that historians should recognize the importance of the environment and of geographic studies in the field of history. As such, it is one of the most important texts leading to the recognition of environmental history as a subject and method. Febvre argued, in opposition to some sociologists, that the natural environment does have an important relationship to human affairs, while at the same time arguing against environmental determinism, because many of the critics of a geographical approach to history charged that it made humans into mere pawns of environmental forces. For Febvre, the environment did no more than establish possibilities for societies. Humankind, he insisted, had a broad range of choices within which freedom and creativity operated. And most environmental historians today would generally agree with this. The philosophical portion of Febvre's book has lasting value, both for historical and for contemporary understanding. The book is considered to be a work of human geography and not a historical work per se, although he clearly shows that the legitimate object of research is the relation of the environment to society in its historical evolution. However, he mentions only a few of what we today regard as environmental problems. For example, there is a brief discussion of the deforestation in France, but almost nothing on pollution or the loss of biodiversity. Nevertheless, he is aware that human activities were damaging to the planet, writing, "The civilized man directs his exploitation of the earth with a mastery which has ceased to astonish him, but which, when we reflect on it for a moment, is singularly disturbing." But more than Febvre's book, it was Fernand Braudel's study, The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II, which exemplified the environmental emphasis of the Annales School. This is a history book of 1,300 pages, and the first part is entitled The Role of the Environment, that begins with a section which proclaims mountains come first. In fact, subjects of traditional history do not even appear until the second volume. Braudel offers a convincing argument for the importance of geographical space and the environment to the history of the Mediterranean. He's aware of the changing environment and particularly of a process of deforestation that quickly advanced. He also connected a drier climate to large-scale deforestation. As such, he directly influenced his colleague Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie's book Times of Feast, Times of Famine, which used unorthodox evidence ranging from tree rings to dates of grape harvests and even depictions of the advances and retreats of glaciers in the Alps. Ladurie chronicled war and cold periods, including the Little Ice Age, and demonstrated that climate is far from being a constant in history. Another push to environmental considerations in history came from American frontier historians such as Frederick Jackson Turner and Walter Prescott Webb. Their theory held that the western frontier had provided an environmental safety valve, which kept egalitarian enterprise alive, and the closing of the frontier around 1890 had immense social consequences. Webb described his methods as an approach to history through geography and the physical environment. Another early American environmental historian was James Malin, who wrote The Grassland of North America, which provided awareness of the ecological changes that accompanied the settlement of the Great Plains. In fact, Hughes argues that this strand of research was the undoubtful reason why the US became the theater for the initial appearance and development of environmental history as a self-conscious field of inquiry in the latter part of the 20th century, which we will be tackling in our next video. So that's it for today. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and state your historical emergencies in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.